There's a very strong paragraph on the role of health workers, and I think that's something people are proud of, and the need to recognize and adequately reimburse healthcare workers.
Hmm.
In a lot of the preamble language, the word gender was cut.
Hello, I'm Françoise Girard with the famous podcast. You can find us online at fmus.org. Today we're speaking to Nina Schwalbe, who's a master's of public health and a PhD. She is the CEO of Spark Street Advisors, a global public health policy and strategy think tank that was established in 2016. Dr. Schwalbe has held senior roles at Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, as well as at UNICEF, the Open Society Institute, and USAID, among others. She's also a senior scholar at Georgetown's O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. And today we're going to speak about the US's role in international agreements and international assistance on health. Nina, it's a real pleasure to talk to you today. What I wanted to discuss with you are the actions the US is taking to unravel, literally, international cooperation and international agreements that advance global health, and why that should concern us all.
There's a number of things that the US has done, that the Trump administration has done in its first few weeks, which have really had a major impact on international health. There was the dismantling of the foreign assistance structure, most of which cannot be recreated.
Yeah.
There was withdrawal from any official relations or most official relations between US government officials at the Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization, and we can come back to that. And then there's the general positioning that they're beginning to take in the UN more broadly about the well-agreed Sustainable Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Agenda
Yeah.
to advance health and well-being of people around the world. So those are really three big decisions which have all impacted the way that we deliver global health assistance and the way that we think about international global health.
Yeah, and you have, vast experience in global health, whether on vaccines, child health, infectious disease, pandemic response, and more. So you're really well placed to give us that perspective. Let's dive a little bit into the World Health Organization. What does WHO do for those people who are not so familiar with it, and why does it matter that the US is announcing that it intends to pull out of it?
That's a great question. The World Health Organization is the body set up within the UN system that creates norms and standards around health practices. So they develop guidelines. In the US, we're quite lucky in a way because we have our own Food and Drug Administration, which sets norms and guidelines for the US population. But this is an organization that helps understand what and how countries should deliver effective services and medicines, what should be priorities, how to think about prioritization. They also help on some very technical issues. They monitor what strains of flu are happening around, influenza are happening around the world, so-called seasonal influenza, and they advise countries collectively on what are the best ways to produce vaccines on an annual basis to make sure that we're addressing the particular strain of flu that's a problem. So they do things very technically in terms of helping us think about what are the right kinds of medicines to develop, as well as globally, as well as developing programmatic guidance for what's the most effective way to implement life-saving programs.
Right. And all countries are members of the World Health Organization, right? So that's a
All
place
countries are
also where,
members, and the US has stated its intention to withdraw. And
right.
that withdrawal normally takes a year, although Congress theoretically could decide to speed it up, which would be a problem. The withdrawal is also problematic because First of all, the US owes money, which it hasn't paid up yet. Normally, the
Mm-hmm.
WHO pays in advance and the US pays back pay. So they're stuck with a bill that the US hasn't paid, even if the US does withdraw. And then there are two types of contributions that the US makes to the World Health Organization. One is so-called assessed, and what that means is every country, according to its national wealth, pays a certain amount according to a
Mm.
formula. And another is called voluntary, and that's where countries step in of particular programs of interest. Like the US has been a major contributor to polio eradication, to
Right.
health emergencies, to immunization, to tuberculosis. There are a couple of areas where that's over and on top of that so-called assessed or mandatory membership contribution. And what we've done now is just pulled out of some of those as of immediately, leaving those programs scrambling for what to do next, leaving people untreated and staff in limbo.
Right. And all these countries that are members of WHO meet at the World Health Assembly, right? And that's an opportunity for them to strategize, to organize, to plan, to address these because health is a global issue. I mean, there's no borders when you talk about healthcare or disease, right? So it seems very counterproductive not to be part of those conversations, even if one
That's
disagrees with various aspects of what WHO is doing.
That's very true, particularly the very technical ones. And in addition to the US being part of WHO, so being part of every conversation, it also seconded, meaning provided staff for free
Mm-hmm.
from very technical agencies in the US to make sure that we were in the discussion and providing advice. So there were many staff both in Geneva and around the world. And that's in addition to the hundreds of American staff who work in the World Health Organization, who were part of the conversation. And just give you a recent example of the Ebola outbreak in Uganda, or there's
Right.
an undiagnosed outbreak in DRC, where before the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, would have been part and parcel of those discussions through a WHO collaborating mechanism. So there's
Right.
an undiagnosed outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The WHO, the government contacts the WHO calls a meeting of all partners, and they talk about what to do, how to address it, what lab capacity is needed. And then that information also feeds back to the US to say, hey, this might be coming. We need to prepare in the US for potential.
Mm-hmm.
We're first in line on the information chain, also for things that are going to have the potential to travel to the US. And what happened is by pulling any kind of discussion between CDC and the World Health Organization, we just cut ourselves out of those discussions. And we're hearing about it instead of through our own CDC, we're hearing about it through the internet, through friends of friends. It's not coming from an official channel. And there are some serious and scary disease outbreaks now happening around the world. Ebola, Marburg, the Mpox virus continues to rage in many countries. So that kind of just willfully pulling us out of technical discussions is highly problematic and counterintuitive
Yeah, inexplicable
for
to me
national
anyway.
security.
Right, right. And then you spoke about the other aspect of what they've been doing, which is repudiating sustainable development goals and the development agenda. I mean, it could be easy to dismiss these, lofty agreements as, oh, it's just, pie in the sky, 17 goals for sustainable development. But they were negotiated by all governments over many years, and the US was part of all these discussions. And I think it does matter that the US is pulling out of this, but I'm curious to hear what you think. You may be more skeptical than I am about
No,
those agreements.
really important goals. And I think, unfortunately, the US, over decades and decades, since agencies like the US Agency for International Development was set up decades ago, has
Hmm.
positioned themselves as caring about this issue and has made an important place for itself as part of its soft diplomacy in supporting other countries to achieve health and well-being.
Yeah.
And so pulling out is symbolic, and it's also pretty much crushes the chance of reaching many of these goals. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy to say, they're unrealistic or pie in the sky, and then to pull out all your funding for them, particularly things like maternal mortality or tuberculosis control or access to education. These are relatively non-controversial programs. I think everybody agrees that a woman should not die in childbirth. And
Right.
yet, we've just crushed, in one executive order, crushed the hopes of being part of a global effort of every country to make these happen.
Yes. And speaking, for example, of deaths in childbirth, maternal mortality, this is highly feasible. It's not pie in the sky. That is, we know what to do to prevent deaths of pregnant persons in pregnancy and in childbirth, and there's no reason we can't all pull together and do this, so that we just say, we don't care anymore as a country. The U.S.,
Yeah.
since I am a U.S. citizen, is really shocking. Like, we're just walking away, and we won't fund any interventions in
And
that
I
respect.
agree. Maternal mortality is such an avoidable mortality. It is avoidable in most cases. So
Yeah.
it's a tragic pull away. I think for me, what worries me more, and I've said this a couple of times, is the U.S. being problematic and pushing some of its new agendas on the UN system by remaining in the conversation. So I would rather
For
see them walk
example,
away from the WHO and the UN discussions than push some of their agenda. So, for example, there are a number of new executive orders which affect our ability to deliver good healthcare and health. And the two or three most specific examples are an executive order against so-called diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, which
right.
means that in health, we focus a lot on the social determinants of health and what are the underlying barriers that affect people's access to care. And we know that there are populations that are heavily marginalized, and we can't call out those marginalized populations or target any sort of population for any reason. And that could be people of color, that could be elderly. It's this whole idea is you can't target, and target sounds like a bad word, but you can't, let me use a better word, you can't tailor your interventions to the needs of the people that require them most. So even with an issue like maternal mortality, we don't see that writ large. We see it among poorer, marginalized populations.
Right.
Second order that's highly divisive is defining gender as producing sperm or eggs. And as simple as that, we've made so much progress in the last couple of years on thinking about gender in a non-binary way.
Yeah.
And that is written into the constitutions and laws of many other countries. So the US may have an opinion on that, and the lawmakers may decide one way, but the idea that we would force that on other agencies or bodies seems out of place.
Right. So it's kind of a mixed, yeah. On the one hand, really the US should not pull out of international agreements and international bodies. On the other hand, this kind of US government that we're currently dealing with these kinds of ideological positions that defy science and evidence, maybe it's just as well if they're not forcing their views on other governments. It's really tragic in that sense, that situation.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with UN meetings next week on women coming up, it will be really interesting to see what on the status of women. It's the
Yeah.
Commission on the Status of Women coming up at the UN. It will be interesting to see if they take a silent position or they take an aggressive, disruptive position. And my fear is that the latter, they're going to take an aggressive and disruptive position.
Right.
And I would
Against,
them in the room.
sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender and so on. Yeah. And let's talk also about the pandemic treaty that, I mean, people may not be aware, my listeners may not be aware that there's been, last few years, I think, negotiations on a new international treaty to deal with pandemics. I suppose in reaction to COVID and the fact that we realized that international agreements were not up to the task, right? And you've been involved in that. Can you tell me where that's at right now, and what is the U.S. posture with respect to this treaty?
Yeah, thanks for raising the treaty. 3 years ago, there was a decision that we needed a better international agreement to respond to treaties, that there were some regulations in place called the International Health Regulations, which is also legally binding, but
Yeah.
focused on what countries themselves should be doing internally. And the idea was, particularly with the vaccine inequity and some countries getting access and other not, and the overall inequities that COVID pointed out, that we needed an instrument, or there was a need for an instrument to bind countries together in terms of their accountabilities and responsibilities to one another. The process started 3 years ago. It covers a lot of different issues, from how we share research and development, technology transfer, how we think about the interaction between animal health and human health. It's a very wide-ranging treaty. It's about 30 pages long, so which is not too big for a treaty itself, and covers a lot of these big issues. The treaty is in the very final stages of negotiation. There's one more meeting left to agree to the text. And I would say it's about 80% agreed, or 90% agreed. And there's still some sticky issues that relate, particularly related to this idea of, if countries share their genomic materials, do they get any benefit from sharing those in terms of products that are developed with them? And that came out of the Omicron variant, where South Africa announced it, shared the data, and then didn't have access to the vaccines. And some other issues around what are countries' responsibilities with regard to various commitments if there's no financing behind those commitments. So there are a few issues left, but they have made incredible progress. There are 5 negotiating days left in April to finalize the text and present it to this World Health Assembly, which is the meeting of all member states. They come together once a year in Geneva to make decisions on big policy issues. The US has pulled out of negotiation. It was an explicit part of the executive order that they would no longer engage in the negotiations. Frankly, they were quite helpful in past negotiations. The delegation was overall helpful. I think with this administration, it's probably better. I think that's a good decision.
If they just pull out
without them. And they were not in the last negotiating session, and the world has continued fine in the discussions without them. And they wouldn't. So what happens with an international treaty is that once it's agreed at the World Health Assembly, it's sort of endorsed to move forward, and then individual countries have to signal that they want in. And 60 countries have to signal that they want in order for it to come into force. So it's a long process anyway. So just because we missed it at this stage doesn't mean we can't join it at a later stage. The most important thing is that it actually moves forward, because a lot of good ground was covered. It may not be perfect, but as Dr. Tedros, who's the head of the World Health Organization, point out, with the treaty, we really shouldn't let perfection be the enemy of the good.
And does that treaty, I'm thinking of the role that women health workers played in dealing with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and how they were frontline health workers in a lot of cases. Does that treaty deal with some of these questions of gender and women's role in as frontline healthcare?
There's a very strong paragraph on the role of health workers, and I think that's something people are proud of, and the need to recognize and adequately reimburse healthcare workers. In a lot of the preamble language, the word gender was cut.
Because
you tell me. You're one of the biggest
was
gender experts I know.
it the Holy See and the Catholic forces, or
it was a wide range of groups that didn't say that they don't want to specify any particular group. And even with the US, I mean, the last administration was supportive of including gender, but there were forces against specifying any vulnerable populations. Even children have been cut.
Seriously?
Yeah, so there's a big pushback on specifying any type of quote unquote vulnerable or quote unquote special populations, or referring to them.
This is what it's come to, huh?
Unfortunately. On the
Wow.
good side, though, the health workers is strong and it's a very strong statement on the role of health workers. And as you rightly said, most of whom frontline workers are women.
Now, tell me in closing, now that the US is walking away, and as you say, maybe it's just as well they're not there to scuttle everything. What are other governments doing? Are we seeing leadership from other governments? Are they stepping up in really driving this agenda? Are
Unfortunately,
there
not
lead? No, you're
yet.
not seeing leaders really taking the
Not
torch
yet.
forward.
We're seeing, I think it was partly just bad timing. We're seeing other countries also pulling out of global health. The Netherlands announced recently it had made a decision. Switzerland has made a decision. The UK has recently announced a decrease and a cut. Some of these were in place before the Trump administration announced its cut to US foreign assistance, but regardless, we're definitely seeing more cuts. There's a major election coming up in Australia in the next couple of weeks. The opposition party is not particularly pro-aid. So not really. And no,
No.
unfortunately not. And in the treaty negotiations, I would say that the US was a good player in the last one. So they weren't an oversized or outside voice in the room. So
Yeah.
it's the same players. It's more
Under
developed.
Biden, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, under President Biden.
Yeah.
It's more in the treaty negotiations, the interest of the pharmaceutical companies versus the interest of developing countries. So those dynamics are still playing out without the US. The US didn't have a stronger position per se than the European Union, which has been very protective of its pharmaceutical industries.
Right.
But
Right.
no, nobody's stepping in.
Well, that is something to keep an eye on. Thank you, Nina, for giving us this perspective and really sharing your insights. I'll be in touch with you to find out how things develop over
Okay,
the
well,
next
thanks for covering it.
few weeks and months. And let's hope, let's keep fighting for health and human rights. It's a worthy agenda. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Françoise. Bye.
Expiro, expiro in te.